What did evenings feel like in a world without clocks, without strict schedules, and without a fixed moment when the day was supposed to end? For most Romans, the evening was not a clear boundary. It was not something that arrived all at once. Instead, it unfolded gradually, shaped by fading light, slowing movement, and the quiet sense that less needed to be done. In ancient Roman towns, the end of the day was not announced. There were no signals telling people when to stop. Work did not suddenly finish, and streets did not empty at a certain hour. The day simply began to release its hold, allowing activity to soften and attention to withdraw. This change was subtle. Light shifted across stone walls and narrow streets. Sounds became fewer and more spaced out. People moved more slowly, not because they were told to, but because the environment itself began to ask for less. Tonight, we will spend time inside that gentle transition. There is nothing you need to follow closely and nothing you need to remember. The details can pass quietly one after another as we explore how an ordinary Roman day came to a close. If your attention drifts, that is perfectly fine. The evening will continue calmly in the background, allowing the world of the past to settle at its own unhurried pace. As that gentle transition begins, there is no clear signal that evening has arrived. In the Roman world, sunset was not a point on a timeline. It was not something people waited for or identified precisely. Instead, it revealed itself gradually through small changes that accumulated over time. The day did not end. It slowly loosened its grip. The first change was not darkness, but a shift in the quality of light. Sunlight became lower and less direct, slipping across walls at new angles. Stone surfaces that had reflected brightness earlier in the day now absorbed it more softly. Colors lost some of their sharpness, edges blurred slightly. The world did not dim suddenly, it softened. In Roman towns, this change was uneven. Narrow streets fell into shadow earlier than open courtyards. Buildings cast long shapes that stretched across pathways and doorways. Some areas remained bright for a while longer, while others became dim and quiet much sooner. Evening did not arrive everywhere at once. It moved slowly, section by section, reshaping the town without announcement. Season also changed what evening felt like, without anyone needing to think about it. In warmer months, light stayed present a little longer, and the air often became more comfortable just as the day was releasing its grip. People could remain outside without strain, not because they were extending the day, but because the environment itself made stillness easier to tolerate. The transition into night could feel wide and gentle, as if the day had more space to fade. In colder months, the change could feel quicker, not in the sense of a sudden switch, but in the sense that the body reached its limit earlier. Darkness arrived sooner, and with it came the natural pull toward sheltered spaces. The town did not become different, but the evening narrowed faster. People retreated earlier, not as a decision, but as a response to temperature, visibility, and the quiet desire to conserve warmth and effort. This seasonal variability did not create anxiety. There was no expectation that evenings should look the same every day. The day ended when it became easier to stop than to continue, and that point moved naturally across the year. The body adapted without commentary because the world offered no alternative that would have made adaptation unnecessary. People did not need to look at the sky to know this change was happening. Their bodies sensed it. Tasks that required precision became harder to continue. Fine detail was more difficult to see. Movement slowed naturally as vision adjusted. This slowing was not a decision. It was a response to the environment asking for less. Shadows played an important role in this transition. As the sun lowered, shadows lengthened and deepened. They gathered along walls, under roofs, and in doorways. Familiar spaces began to feel slightly different, not unfamiliar, but quieter. The presence of shadow reduced visual detail, and with it, the sense of urgency that daylight often brings. There was no fixed hour when Romans believed the day should end. Without clocks dividing time into equal parts, evening was not measured, it was experienced. One person might feel the day ending earlier, another later, depending on where they were, what they were doing, and how much light remained around them. Time was not imposed, it was sensed. As light continued to fade, activity began to change shape rather than stop. Work did not suddenly cease, instead it narrowed. Tasks were finished rather than expanded. New efforts were postponed without discussion. Tools were set down because continuing no longer felt efficient or necessary. This withdrawal happened quietly, guided by comfort rather than instruction. The sensation of slowing extended beyond physical movement. Attention shifted inward. People became less focused on producing or completing and more focused on maintaining what already existed. Conversations softened, movements became smaller. The town began to feel less open and more contained, as if the day were gently folding in on itself. Because there was no expectation of a precise ending, there was no pressure to finish everything before a certain moment. Evening did not create urgency, it created permission to stop. The absence of a fixed time allowed people to release the day without anxiety. Nothing was late, nothing was early. The day simply reached a point where continuing no longer felt natural. In this way, sunset in the Roman world was not an event to observe, but a condition to move within. It shaped behavior without demanding attention. The fading light quietly guided people toward stillness, not by force, but by making stillness the easiest response. As evening deepened, the world offered fewer visual cues and fewer demands. This reduction was not a loss, it was a transition. The day did not disappear. It settled, leaving behind a quieter version of itself, ready to become night. As the day settled into this quieter state, work did not stop abruptly. There was no clear signal telling people to put everything down. Instead, labor began to withdraw in the same gradual way that light had withdrawn from the streets. Activity softened, narrowed, and slowly released its hold on attention. In Roman towns, work was deeply tied to daylight. Most tasks depended on natural light rather than artificial sources. As that light faded, the shape of work changed. Activities that required careful vision became harder to continue. Fine movements demanded more effort. The body began to resist tasks that no longer felt efficient or comfortable. This resistance was not conscious. People did not decide that it was time to stop working. They simply noticed that continuing required more strain than it was worth. Mistakes became easier to make. Progress slowed. At some point, the effort no longer matched the result, and so work began to ease without discussion. Workshops reflected this transition clearly. Tools were cleaned and set aside. Materials were gathered and secured. Not everything needed to be finished before nightfall. What mattered was leaving things in a state that could be returned to the next day. Work paused rather than ended with the understanding that tomorrow would allow it to continue. Different kinds of work released at different speeds. Tasks that depended on fine vision, careful cutting, detailed repair, reading, measuring, inspecting, were often the first to lose their place. The eye had to work harder for the same result, and the mind sensed that strain quickly. In that sense, evening did not cancel labor, it simply raised the cost of precision until precision was no longer worth attempting. Other kinds of work could continue longer because they were guided by familiarity rather than detail. Sorting, carrying, closing, sweeping, gathering, stacking. These actions relied on memory, touch, and routine. They could be done slowly in dim light without forcing the mind to stay sharply awake. These were the tasks that often remained in the background as the day ended, not expanding the day's effort, but gently returning the space to order. What mattered most was not finishing everything, but leaving things in a state that did not create problems tomorrow. Evening encouraged that mindset naturally. A workspace was not abandoned, it was paused. A household was not done with the day. It simply stopped pushing forward. Tomorrow was assumed, not scheduled. The future did not feel urgent because it was not being counted down to. This also changed how people measured what enough meant. During full daylight, there was always another task that could be started. In the evening, starting something new felt unnecessary, even unwise. The mind shifted toward closing rather than opening, not through discipline, but through an instinctive sense that the day had reached the point where continuing would cost more than it would give. There were no official closing hours. One workshop might grow quiet earlier than another, depending on its location, the season, and the kind of work being done. A space that received direct evening light might remain active longer, while one, in a narrow street, fell into shadow much sooner. Evening did not treat all work equally, and no one expected it to. For those working outdoors, the retreat of labor was especially clear. Fields, roads, and construction sites lost visibility quickly. Depth and distance became harder to judge. The body responded by slowing down. Risk increased as light faded, and people naturally adjusted by doing less rather than pushing harder. This slowing did not feel like loss of productivity, it felt appropriate. Work belonged to daylight, and as daylight weakened, work withdrew with it. There was no sense that time was being wasted. The day had simply reached its natural limit. Domestic work followed a similar pattern. Tasks within the home did not disappear in the evening, but they changed in character. Heavy or demanding work was avoided. Instead, people focused on simple maintenance, organizing spaces, preparing for rest, and completing small actions that required little attention. Even these domestic tasks were not rushed. Without clocks measuring productivity, there was no pressure to complete a list before a certain hour. What was done was done. What remained could wait. Evening created a gentle boundary, not a deadline. In shared households, this withdrawal of work happened collectively. One person slowing encouraged others to do the same. Activity did not need coordination. It aligned naturally. As fewer tasks remained, people found themselves closer together, not by intention, but because there was less reason to be spread out. Public spaces also reflected this change. Markets thinned gradually. Traders did not suddenly pack up at the same time. Instead, stalls closed one by one as demand faded and light weakened. The sound of commerce softened. The urgency of exchange disappeared. This gradual retreat changed the emotional tone of work. During the day, it demanded attention and effort. In the evening, it asked for completion rather than expansion. The mind shifted from planning and problem-solving toward acceptance. What had been accomplished was enough. Importantly, this transition did not carry guilt. Stopping work did not feel like failure or laziness. It felt correct. The environment itself signaled that it was time to let go. Evening offered permission to stop without explanation. Some work continued later than others, especially tasks that could be done by feel rather than sight. But even then, activity was limited and careful. There was no attempt to extend the day artificially. Lamps were not used to turn night into more daylight. Light was conserved, and with it, energy and attention. As work withdrew, the town's rhythm shifted, the collective pace slowed. Movement became less purposeful and more transitional. People were no longer heading toward tasks, but toward places of rest. The direction of motion changed from outward to inward. This shift did not require rules or enforcement. It was supported by habit. Everyone knew, without thinking about it, that evening was not meant for beginning new work. It was meant for finishing what was already in motion and then allowing the day to settle. The retreat of labor also softened social interaction. Conversations related to work faded, voices lowered, exchanges became shorter and less urgent. The town did not fall silent, but it became less demanding. It asked less of everyone moving through it. As the light continued to thin, fewer people remained engaged in any kind of labor. Those who were still active moved slowly and deliberately. There was no sense of competition with time. Time itself felt broader, less segmented, less insistent. In this way, work did not end because night arrived. Night arrived because work had already begun to step back. The two processes moved together, each supporting the other. The withdrawal of labor made space for night, and the coming of night made withdrawal feel natural. By the time darkness became noticeable, most work had already released its hold. What remained was quiet movement, simple presence, and the sense that the day had given what it could. There was nothing more it needed to demand. The town, having worked enough, allowed itself to rest. As the town allowed itself to rest, its physical shape began to change as well. Not in structure, but in how space was used and experienced. The city did not grow smaller in size, but it became smaller in practice. Areas that had been active during the day gradually withdrew from use, leaving only a limited network of familiar, sheltered spaces. During daylight, Roman towns felt open and expansive. Streets connected markets, workshops, public buildings, and homes. Movement flowed outward, spreading across neighborhoods. In the evening, this flow reversed. The range of movement narrowed. People stayed closer to their homes, and the paths they used became shorter and more predictable. Public spaces were among the first to lose their role. Forums, squares, and wide intersections no longer drew people in. Without daylight, these places offered little reason to remain. They did not disappear, but they became transitional rather than central. People crossed them if necessary, but they no longer gathered there. As light faded, the edges of buildings softened into shadow. Corners became less defined. The visual depth of streets collapsed inward, making distances feel shorter and spaces feel closer. This visual contraction reduced stimulation. There was simply less to take in, less to notice, and less to respond to. Streets that had once been filled with layered sounds became quieter, but not silent. Footsteps echoed more clearly against stone surfaces. Voices carried farther, even when spoken softly. With fewer sounds overall, each noise stood out briefly before fading again. The city did not hum. It breathed slowly. Movement through the town became purposeful. People no longer wandered. They traveled only when needed, moving between known points, home, a nearby neighbor, or a familiar doorway. The idea of exploring or lingering lost its appeal as visibility dropped. The city gently discouraged unnecessary motion. As visibility fell, the town became less of a visual landscape and more of a soundscape. In daylight, a street could be read quickly through shapes and motion. In the evening, people relied more on what they heard: the direction of footsteps, the texture of a voice, the brief clink of a vessel being set down, the soft scrape of a door closing. Sound carried differently against stone, and with fewer competing noises, even small sounds seemed clearer for a moment before fading again. This did not make the city feel dramatic. It made it feel readable in a different way. A familiar rhythm of movement signaled normality. An unusual rhythm stood out, not as danger by default, but as difference. Most evenings, difference was minor: someone returning later than usual, a neighbor finishing a final task, an animal shifting in place. These details did not demand attention. They simply confirmed that life continued quietly within the narrowing frame of the night. Smells also became more noticeable as activity slowed. The warm mineral scent of stone that had held the day's heat, the faint smoke of cooking or a dying fire, the presence of animals nearby. These were not sharp sensations, but familiar ones, and familiarity is one of the simplest forms of calm. The senses did not go searching for novelty. They settled into what they already knew. In this way, the evening city did not feel empty. It felt reduced. Fewer signals, fewer demands, fewer reasons to move. And in that reduction, the mind found it easier to loosen its grip on the day. Shadows played a growing role in shaping experience. Doorways, walls, and overhangs merged into continuous dark shapes. This reduced the sense of separation between structures. The city felt less detailed and more unified, as if it were folding inward rather than spreading outward. This contraction was not enforced. There were no barriers closing off sections of the town. Instead, the environment itself guided behavior. Dim light, reduced activity, and familiarity made smaller spaces feel sufficient. People did not feel confined, they felt contained. Homes became the primary centers of activity. Light, when used, was concentrated there. A single lamp inside a doorway created a visible point of warmth and presence. From the outside, these points of light were scattered and uneven, suggesting life without illuminating the street itself. The presence of light inside homes made the contrast with the outside more noticeable. Streets appeared darker by comparison. This contrast encouraged retreat rather than movement. The town subtly invited people inward, away from open spaces and into sheltered ones. Animals contributed to this nighttime contraction. Dogs, donkeys, and other domestic animals moved less as evening deepened. Their presence was still felt, but their activity diminished. Occasional sounds from animals were familiar and grounding, reinforcing the sense that the night followed a known pattern. The narrowing of space also affected social interaction. Encounters became fewer and more intentional. A brief greeting, a short exchange of words. There was little reason to linger in conversation outdoors. Interaction moved indoors where light and warmth were available. Even as the town contracted, social life did not vanish. It became smaller in scale. Encounters that might have happened casually during the day became brief and deliberate in the evening. A person might step to a neighbor's doorway for a short exchange, not to begin something new, but to close something already in motion. A message passed along, an object returned, a simple check that did not require explanation. Doorways mattered in this part of the day. They were not just entrances, they were boundaries where inside and outside met without conflict. A threshold could hold conversation without pulling anyone fully back into the street. You could speak from the edge of the home, remain within the safety of familiarity, and still feel connected to the lives around you. This kind of contact was light. It did not demand energy, it confirmed continuity. Because light was limited, these moments often stayed close to whatever illumination existed. A lamp inside a doorway did not brighten the street, but it made faces briefly readable. It created a soft focus point where a few words could be exchanged without effort. Then the darkness beyond could take over again without feeling like a loss. These were not hours for long gatherings outdoors. The environment did not support it, and most people did not expect it. But small connections still happened. A household was not sealed off from the town, it was simply less exposed to it. The night encouraged a quieter form of community, one based on proximity, habit, and brief familiarity rather than extended presence. In this way, the evening did not isolate individuals. It gently reorganized relationships. It reduced the number of interactions, but it could make the ones that remained feel steadier, more grounded, and less performative. A short exchange could be enough. The town did not need constant social activity to feel alive. It needed only the quiet sense that others were nearby, moving through the same fading light. This shift reduced unpredictability. With fewer people moving through fewer spaces, the town became easier to read. Patterns stabilized. The night felt calmer, not because it was empty, but because it was consistent. Familiar routes, familiar sounds, familiar rhythms repeated themselves. As the city contracted, it also became more intimate. Boundaries between private and public space blurred slightly. Sounds from inside homes travelled outward, while outdoor sounds filtered in. Life continued on both sides of the wall, gently overlapping. The reduced scale of movement also shaped perception of time. Without varied activity and visual cues, moments blended together. Evening did not feel like a countdown toward night. It felt like a broad, open interval in which very little was required. This environment supported a gradual inward turn of attention. With fewer external demands, people became more aware of their immediate surroundings. The body relaxed as the need to respond decreased. The city itself participated in this calming process. Importantly, this contraction did not signal danger or withdrawal from life. It signaled completion. The day had unfolded fully, and now its energy was being gathered rather than dispersed. The town was not shutting down, it was consolidating. The same streets existed, the same buildings stood in place, but their role had changed. They no longer asked to be navigated or used extensively. They simply existed in the background, holding the quiet continuation of life. As darkness became more complete, the city reached a stable nighttime form. Movement was limited but steady. Presence was felt even when unseen. The town had settled into itself, prepared for the slower rhythm that would carry it through the night. In this contracted state, the city offered safety through familiarity and calm through predictability. There was little need to watch closely or remain alert. Everything important was already nearby. The day had not vanished. It had folded inward, leaving behind a quieter, smaller version of the same world, one that required less effort, less attention, and less movement. And within that smaller world, people found it easier to rest. As the city folded inward and movement slowed, life did not disappear. It relocated. Attention shifted from streets and public spaces toward the interior of homes, where the evening took on a more contained and intimate form. This transition did not feel abrupt. It felt like a continuation of the same gentle withdrawal that had already shaped the town outside. Roman houses were not designed to isolate individuals from one another. Most were organized around shared spaces rather than private rooms. As evening settled in, these shared areas became the natural centers of activity. People gathered not for deliberate social occasions, but because light, warmth, and familiarity drew them together. Artificial light was introduced carefully. Lamps were lit only where necessary, creating small pools of visibility rather than fully illuminated rooms. A single flame might be enough to support several people at once, encouraging closeness without requiring conversation. The edges of rooms remained in shadow, softening boundaries and reducing visual detail. Using light in the evening was a practical decision, not a background convenience. A lamp did not simply exist as part of the room. It had to be filled, tended, and kept stable. The flame was small, but it mattered. It marked the difference between a space that could support a little activity and a space that was ready to release activity entirely. This meant that light carried a certain kind of discipline without needing to feel strict. People learned through habit how much light was enough. They learned what could be done near a lamp and what could wait until daylight. They also learned that light was not meant to defeat the night. It was meant to create a small island of visibility inside it. The quality of lamplight also shaped the mood. It did not fill a room evenly. It created a center and a perimeter, bright near the flame, dark at the edges. This unevenness reduced visual stimulation. It softened faces, it simplified objects. It made the world feel smaller and more contained, and containment is one of the quiet conditions that makes rest easier. Even the small tasks of tending a lamp encouraged calm, adjusting a wick, making sure the vessel was stable, placing it where it would not be knocked. These actions were careful, not frantic. They did not speed the evening up. They slowed it down because fire demands steadiness. In that way, the very act of using light quietly taught the body how to move in a lower energy mode. And when a lamp was finally extinguished, it often felt like a natural conclusion, not a dramatic one, but a gentle signal that nothing more needed doing. Darkness did not mean something had gone wrong. It meant the environment was now doing its part. It was allowing the mind to stop paying attention to details because details no longer mattered. The room could return to shadow and the body could follow. Evening inside a home could feel very different depending on the kind of home it was. In a larger household with a courtyard, the fading light still had room to move. The sky above the open space would soften gradually, and that softness would filter inward. People could sit near the courtyard edge and remain connected to the outside world without being exposed to it. The transition into night felt spacious, as if the home breathed along with the town. In more crowded living arrangements where space was tighter and walls were closer, evening could feel more immediate. Sounds from nearby neighbors carried more easily. Movement was shared more closely. The boundary between one household and the next was thinner, not necessarily in conflict, but in presence. Night did not isolate people, it gathered them into a denser fabric of nearby lives, and yet the rhythm was similar in both settings. Light was still limited. Activity still narrowed. The body still responded to the same signals. Less visibility, less movement, less need to keep producing. Whether the space was wide or tight, the evening had the same purpose. It helped life become simpler for a while, so rest could arrive without being forced. This limited light shaped behavior immediately. Movements became slower and more deliberate. There was no reason to rush. Without bright illumination, actions unfolded at a pace that matched the environment. The body adjusted naturally, conserving energy and attention. Evening tasks inside the home were simple and repetitive. There was no attempt to extend the day's productivity. Instead, people focused on small acts of maintenance, adjusting bedding, organizing belongings, preparing simple food, or securing the space for the night. These tasks did not demand concentration. They followed familiar patterns learned through repetition. Conversation during this time was unforced. Some evenings included quiet exchanges, while others passed with little speech at all. Silence was not awkward, it was expected. Presence mattered more than interaction. People did not need to fill the evening with activity or discussion. Being together in the same space was enough. The physical structure of Roman homes supported this calm. Thick walls moderated temperature. Courtyards allowed air to circulate. Doorways and openings were adjusted to balance airflow and warmth. These changes were subtle, made without much thought, guided by habit rather than instruction. As evening advanced, comfort became less about doing and more about adjusting. Temperature shifted. Air moved differently through courtyards, doorways, and narrow passages. A home did not aim for a constant climate. It responded to the night. People did the same, using small changes rather than large interventions. A textile could become a tool for evening, not a luxury. A cloak pulled closer. A blanket folded and placed where someone would later lie down. The movement of fabric was quiet and repetitive, and repetition itself has a calming effect. It asks very little from the mind. It simply continues until the body feels ready to stop. Where people sat also mattered. They tended to choose places that felt naturally stable, nearer to warmth when the air cooled, nearer to airflow when the air felt still. These choices were rarely discussed. They were instinctive. The body moved toward what made the evening easier to inhabit. This kind of adjustment helped the night arrive without tension. When comfort is achieved through small shifts, the mind stays soft. It does not enter problem-solving mode. It does not need to fight the environment. It simply meets it. And when the environment is met rather than resisted, rest comes more easily. Evening meals, when they occurred, were modest. There was no fixed dinner hour. Eating happened when it felt appropriate, often earlier rather than later. Food was simple and portions were practical. The goal was nourishment, not ceremony. Meals fit into the evening rather than defining it. In many Roman households, the main meal of the day often belonged to the late afternoon or early evening, but it did not belong to a clock. People did not sit down because an hour had arrived. They sat down because work had released them, because light was thinning, and because the household was naturally gathering back into one place. The meal did not interrupt the evening. It followed the evening's slow logic. The character of the food matched the character of the time. This was not a moment designed to stimulate the mind or keep the body sharply awake. It was meant to restore energy and create a simple sense of completion. Even when food was shared, the atmosphere could remain quiet. The sounds were small, bowls being set down, fabric brushing stone, low voices that did not need to carry. Because the home was already becoming dim, the meal also changed how the space felt. People stayed close to where the light was strongest. The edges of the room remained soft and indistinct. This meant that eating was less about visual detail and more about familiarity, the feel of the vessel in the hand, the known rhythm of chewing, the presence of others nearby. The meal became another way the body was guided inward, away from the day's outward momentum. And because there was no fixed endpoint, the meal did not have to conclude in a formal way. There was no sense of, we must finish quickly, or we must keep this going. It ended when it ended. Small amounts could be eaten slowly. Conversation could rise briefly, then fade again. Silence could return without the feeling that something was missing. In modern life, meals often become time markers. They divide the day into compartments. In the Roman evening, the meal could do the opposite. It could blend into the evening and support its softness, making the transition into rest feel natural rather than scheduled. The day did not need to be explained or summarized. It could simply be set down, in the same way a bowl is set down when the body has had enough. After eating, there was no expectation of entertainment. There were no activities designed to keep people alert or engaged late into the night. The absence of stimulation allowed the body to continue its gradual movement toward rest. Children remained close to adults, absorbing the same calm rhythm. They were not separated into different spaces or schedules. Their presence blended naturally into the evening environment. As light dimmed and activity softened, children drifted toward rest without being directed. Older members of the household also settled into quieter patterns. Their movements slowed further, and their awareness often remained slightly more alert. This difference was not disruptive. It contributed to the balance of the household, allowing some to rest deeply while others remained gently aware. Sound inside the home changed as well. Daytime noises, tools, movement, conversation gave way to softer sounds. Fabric brushing against stone, a lamp being adjusted, quiet footsteps. These sounds did not interrupt calm, they confirmed it. The limited use of light meant that people relied more on memory than sight. Familiar spaces were navigated easily, even in dim conditions. This reliance reduced the need for attention. The body moved confidently without requiring constant visual confirmation. As evening progressed, activity became increasingly inward-focused. People sat, reclined, or lay down without a strict boundary between resting and sleeping. The transition into rest was gradual, allowing the body to release tension without effort. The absence of clocks played a subtle but important role. Without a device marking the passage of time, there was no sense of being late or early. The evening was not measured, it simply unfolded. This lack of measurement removed pressure and preserved calm. Homes did not become silent, but they became predictable. The same small sounds repeated night after night. This predictability reassured the nervous system, allowing rest to deepen naturally. There was no performance of relaxation, no effort to wind down. Evening did that work on its own. The environment, dim light, reduced movement, familiar presence, guided the body toward stillness without instruction. As darkness outside became complete, the interior of the home reached its own stable rhythm. Lamps burned quietly, people settled into positions of rest. The day's demands had already faded, leaving behind only what was necessary. The home did not prepare people for sleep through ritual, it prepared them through consistency. Each evening resembled the one before it closely enough that the body recognized what was coming next. In this way, the beginning of evening inside Roman homes was not a separate phase of life. It was the final softening of the day, a space where effort diminished, attention narrowed, and the body was allowed to follow its natural inclination toward rest. Within these walls, protected by familiarity and dim light, the night was no longer something approaching. It had already arrived quietly, ready to carry the household forward into deeper stillness. With the night already settled inside the home, what remained of the evening was not empty time. It was simply time that asked for very little. Activity did not disappear, but it became softer, smaller, and less demanding. These were not hours meant for achievement or progress. They were meant for presence. Evening activities in Roman households were shaped by limited light and limited energy. Anything that required strong focus or precise vision was avoided. Instead, people turned to actions that could be done slowly, often by touch or memory rather than sight. The pace was unhurried, not because anyone tried to slow down, but because there was no reason to move quickly. Some evenings included quiet conversation. These were not long discussions or debates. Speech was practical, reflective, or simply companionable. Words were exchanged when needed, and silence was allowed to return without discomfort. Conversation did not compete with the night, it adapted to it. In many homes, people sat together without speaking at all. Presence mattered more than interaction. Sitting near a shared light source, listening to familiar sounds, or simply resting in one another's company was enough. There was no expectation that the evening should be filled. Simple handwork sometimes continued into the early evening. Tasks that required little attention, mending fabric, sorting items, preparing tools for the next day, were well suited to this time. These activities were repetitive and calming, guided more by habit than by thought. The repetitive nature of these tasks supported rest rather than delaying it. The hands moved while the mind softened. There was no urgency to complete anything. If a task was left unfinished, it could easily wait. The evening did not demand closure, and children participated naturally in this rhythm. Some remained awake nearby, watching quietly or drifting in and out of sleep. Others rested earlier, carried by the same gentle slowing that shaped the household. No one was asked to stay awake or to go to sleep at a specific moment. Older members of the household often remained quietly alert during this time. Their awareness was calm rather than vigilant. They listened without scanning, noticed without reacting. This light awareness contributed to a sense of stability without introducing tension. The sounds of the home were soft and predictable, the occasional movement of a lamp, the shift of someone changing position, the subtle sounds of breathing and fabric. These noises blended into a continuous background that supported calm rather than interrupting it. Food preparation during the evening was minimal. There was no elaborate cooking late in the day. If food was prepared, it was simple and practical. The goal was comfort, not stimulation. Strong flavors or heavy meals were avoided, not by rule, but by habit. As the evening progressed, people naturally adopted more restful positions. Sitting turned into reclining. Reclining turned into lying down. These transitions were gradual and unmarked. There was no moment when evening activities officially ended. Light continued to play a central role. Lamps burned quietly, their flames steady and low. The limited reach of light reduced visual detail and encouraged stillness. Shadows moved gently along walls, creating subtle motion that required no attention. Fireplaces, when present, were reduced rather than maintained at full strength. Embers glowed softly, offering warmth without brightness. This kind of light did not energize, it reassured. It reminded the body that activity was no longer expected. Outside sounds occasionally filtered in. A distant movement, an animal settling, a faint noise from another household. These sounds were not alarming. They were familiar and grounding, reinforcing the sense that the town itself had entered the same quiet state. There was no concept of evening entertainment as a separate activity. The evening did not exist to be filled, it existed to be passed through gently. The absence of stimulation was not a loss, it was part of what made rest possible. Thoughts during this time slowed naturally. Without bright light or active engagement, the mind drifted easily. Attention wandered without direction. This mental softness prepared the body for deeper rest later in the night. Importantly, these calm activities did not delay sleep, they supported it. Because there was no pressure to remain awake or productive, the body was free to respond to fatigue as it arose. Sleep could arrive gradually without resistance. Evening wakefulness was not treated as something to manage. If someone remained awake longer, that was fine. Rest did not require immediate sleep. Quiet wakefulness was still considered rest. This acceptance removed tension from the evening hours. There was no concern about doing the right thing before bed. There was no checklist to complete. The evening flowed naturally into the night. As activity continued to soften, some people drifted into sleep while others remained lightly aware. These different rhythms coexisted without conflict. The household did not synchronize itself deliberately. It allowed variation. The simplicity of evening activities reinforced familiarity. Each night resembled the last closely enough that the body recognized the pattern. This repetition built trust in the process of rest. The evening did not announce its end. It thinned out gradually, leaving behind fewer actions, fewer sounds, and fewer reasons to remain awake. What remained was quiet presence. In this way, calm evening activities were not a pause between day and night. They were the bridge itself. They allowed the body and mind to cross from activity into rest without effort or interruption. By the time deeper night approached, there was little left to release. The evening had already done its work, gently preparing the household to move further into stillness. With so little left to release, the shift that followed was no longer physical. It was psychological. The body had already slowed, activity had already softened, and the environment no longer asked for attention. What changed now was not what people were doing, but how they were thinking, if they were thinking at all. In the Roman world, night did not arrive as a mental event. There was no moment when the mind was expected to switch from one mode to another. No signal told people that it was now time to rest mentally. Instead, the mind followed the same gradual path as the body, easing itself out of effort simply because there was nothing left to respond to. Without artificial light, without schedules, and without constant stimulation, the mind was not pulled outward. It did not need to track time, plan ahead, or replay the day in detail. As external demands faded, internal activities softened naturally. Thoughts slowed not because people tried to quiet them, but because there was nothing feeding them. The absence of measurement played an important role in this process. Without clocks, there was no awareness of how much time had passed or how much remained. Night was not something to be used efficiently. It was something to move through. This removed pressure from the mind, allowing it to drift rather than focus. Even worries behaved differently in this environment. Concerns about work, obligations, or outcomes had fewer places to attach themselves. The day was already complete. Tomorrow had not yet arrived. There was no benefit in thinking ahead, and the environment offered no cues to do so. One of the quiet reasons the mind could soften was that the night did not contain a countdown. There was no sharp future moment that the body had to prepare for, no signal waiting to pull someone abruptly out of rest. The next day would arrive gradually, just as this one had ended. Without a looming interruption, the mind did not need to stay half awake to protect itself from being startled. This changed the texture of wakefulness. If someone remained awake, it did not feel like being behind. There was nowhere to fall behind to. Wakefulness was not competing with a schedule. It could simply exist, light and uninsistent, until it dissolved on its own. In that atmosphere, sleep did not need to be chased. It could be allowed. This does not mean that Roman nights were entirely free of thought. Reflections still occurred, but they were slower and less structured. Thoughts drifted in fragments rather than forming plans. Images appeared briefly and faded again. The mind did not grip onto ideas, it allowed them to pass. Darkness supported this mental softness. Without visual detail, the mind had less information to process. There were fewer objects to interpret, fewer movements to track. Attention no longer needed to scan the environment. It could settle inward without effort. Sound also contributed to this transition. The predictable, low-level sounds of the household and the town created a stable background. Because these sounds were familiar and unchanging, the mind did not need to react to them. They became part of the silence rather than interruptions within it. In shared spaces, the presence of others reinforced this calm state. Familiar breathing, subtle movement, and quiet proximity signaled safety. The mind did not need to remain alert. It was surrounded by known rhythms and trusted patterns. The psychological transition into night was not uniform. Some minds quieted more quickly, others more slowly. But this variation was accepted. There was no expectation that everyone should rest in the same way or at the same pace. Mental states were allowed to differ without concern. Importantly, there was no concept of trying to fall asleep. Sleep was not a goal to be achieved. It was a condition that emerged when the mind and body were ready. Because there was no pressure to reach sleep, resistance did not form. Wakefulness remained calm rather than tense. This calm wakefulness was still considered rest. Lying quietly, eyes closed or open, listening to familiar sounds. These states were not separate from sleep. They were part of the same continuum. The mind did not distinguish sharply between resting and sleeping. Memory also behaved differently at night. The absence of stimulation reduced the replaying of events. The day faded without review. There was no habit of analyzing what had happened or what should have happened differently. Reflection, if it occurred, was gentle and incomplete. The mind's relationship with time softened further as the night deepened. Without reference points, moments blended together. Wakefulness did not feel extended or brief. It simply existed. This lack of temporal awareness reduced impatience and restlessness. Even physical discomfort was experienced differently. Minor sensations were noticed but not magnified. Without mental focus, they remained background signals rather than problems to solve. The mind did not engage with discomfort unless it demanded attention. The psychological transition into night was supported by repetition. Each evening followed a similar pattern. Over time, the mind learned what to expect. This familiarity reduced alertness automatically. There was no need to consciously prepare for rest. In this environment, anxiety had little space to grow. It was not eliminated, but it was not fed. Without constant input, the mind did not amplify concerns. Calm was not forced. It emerged through absence. For children, this mental transition happened almost automatically. Their attention drifted as stimulation faded. For older adults, the process was slower but equally natural. The night accommodated both without adjustment. Dreams began to appear gradually, often before full sleep arrived. Images surfaced quietly, blending into waking awareness. There was no sharp boundary between imagination and rest. The mind crossed that threshold without noticing. This gradual mental withdrawal meant that sleep, when it arrived, did not feel like a sudden loss of consciousness. It felt like a continuation. Awareness thinned, thoughts dissolved. The body remained supported by familiarity and quiet. The key to this transition was that nothing interfered with it. There were no alarms to anticipate, no screens to stimulate, no obligations pulling attention forward. The night allowed the mind to complete its own process. In modern terms, this might sound like deliberate relaxation, but for Romans it required no technique. The environment did the work. The mind followed. As deeper night approached, mental activity became increasingly sparse. Long stretches passed without thought. Awareness floated in and out gently. Sleep and wakefulness overlapped without conflict. This psychological softness did not mean vulnerability. It meant trust. Trust in the environment, in routine, and in the repetition of life. The night had always come before. It would pass again. In this state, the mind no longer needed to protect itself through alertness. The world had already grown smaller, quieter, and more predictable. There was little left to monitor. Rest, then, was not something that happened to the mind. It was something the mind allowed. The psychological transition into night was the final release of the day's grip. Nothing was concluded deliberately. The mind simply let go, one layer at a time, until awareness became light enough to disappear. And when sleep arrived, it did so gently, without announcement, carrying the mind forward into the deeper quiet that awaited beyond thought. Once the mind had softened and alertness had released its hold, the evening no longer functioned as a transition. It became a state in itself. The work of the day was already complete, and the psychological shift toward rest had already occurred. What remained was not movement toward night, but quiet residence within it. In the Roman world, evening was not something people passed through quickly on their way to sleep. It was a condition that allowed night to arrive fully prepared. By the time true darkness settled, very little adjustment was required. The body, the mind, and the environment were already aligned. This preparation did not happen through conscious intention. No one thought in terms of getting ready for night as a task. Instead, preparation occurred through the steady removal of effort. Each action that faded away left behind a simpler version of life. By evening's end, only what was essential remained. The absence of urgency was central to this process. Evening did not rush people toward bed. It did not demand closure or completion. It allowed time to stretch, not forward but inward. This inward movement reduced the need for direction, leaving space for stillness. The household reflected this change clearly. Objects were no longer being moved with purpose. Tools had been set aside, food had been prepared or eaten, lamps burned quietly or not at all. What remained was presence rather than activity. People did not need to decide when evening ended and night began. The distinction was unnecessary. Evening had already shaped the conditions that night required. Darkness did not interrupt life. It continued it in a simpler form. Because evening repeated itself so consistently, the body learned to recognize it. Muscles loosened more easily. Breathing slowed sooner. Thoughts thinned without resistance. The mind did not need to be convinced to rest. It had been prepared. This preparation extended beyond individuals to the town itself. Streets were quiet, but not empty. Homes were settled, but not sealed. Sound carried gently through familiar pathways. The environment held together in a calm, predictable pattern. The predictability of evening reduced vigilance. There was no reason to remain alert when nothing new was likely to happen. Change had already slowed. The town had reached a stable form that would persist until morning. Even the remaining risks of night, darkness, uncertainty, occasional disturbance, felt smaller now. They were known and accepted. Evening had already absorbed their weight, leaving night free to remain quiet rather than threatening. In this way, evening acted as a buffer. It softened the contrast between day and night so thoroughly that no sharp boundary remained. There was no moment of loss, no sudden withdrawal of light or activity. Everything faded gradually. The body responded to this gradualness instinctively. Fatigue did not arrive suddenly. It spread gently, allowing rest to feel earned rather than imposed. Sleep, when it came, felt like a continuation rather than an interruption. Even those who remained awake longer did so within the same calm state. Wakefulness itself was quiet. Lying still, listening to the settled sounds of the household or the town was not different from rest. It belonged to the same atmosphere. The mind no longer searched for stimulation. Without light, noise, or obligation, there was nothing to hold on to. Thoughts appeared briefly and dissolved. Attention loosened its grip on the external world. Memory faded without resistance. The day did not need to be reviewed. Nothing demanded evaluation. The evening had already closed that chapter gently, without ceremony. This lack of mental closure was not emptiness, it was sufficiency. The day had been enough. It did not require summary or reflection. It could be set down quietly. Evening prepared the body for sleep by removing everything that was not sleep. It did not add techniques or rituals. It subtracted effort. Because of this, sleep did not feel like something that happened after evening. It felt like something that grew out of it. Night did not begin anew. It deepened. The transition from evening into night was so smooth that it often went unnoticed. One moment awareness remained, the next it thinned. There was no point at which sleep had to be chosen. This softness protected the rest that followed. Sleep entered an environment already shaped for it. Darkness was familiar. Silence was layered, not empty. The body rested inside continuity rather than contrast. Even interruptions during the night did not undo this preparation. If someone woke briefly, the calm of evening remained present. The environment did not change. Nothing demanded renewed alertness. In this way, evening extended its influence well into the night. It was not left behind once sleep began. It continued to support rest through familiarity and repetition. The Roman evening did not prepare people for night by instructing them how to sleep. It prepared them by becoming quieter, smaller, and more predictable with each passing moment. Nothing about this process was dramatic. Nothing needed to be remembered. That was its strength. The evening did not ask for attention. It did its work invisibly by stepping out of the way. And so, when night finally settled completely, there was no resistance. The mind had already loosened. The body had already slowed. The town had already contracted. Sleep did not arrive as an event. It arrived as the natural continuation of an evening that had already become still. There was nothing left to release, nothing left to prepare. The day had ended long before sleep began. Evening had done its work. And in that quiet completion, the night could unfold without effort, carrying everything forward into rest exactly as it always had. As the evening settles fully into night, there is nothing more that needs to happen. The day has already withdrawn, quietly and without resistance. What remains is a stable stillness shaped by familiarity, darkness, and the steady repetition of life as it has always been. There is no need to hold on to any detail. Everything important has already been carried forward. In this world, rest does not arrive through effort or intention. It arrives because nothing remains to keep the mind alert. The town has grown smaller, the household has softened, awareness no longer needs to watch or prepare. The night holds its shape gently, allowing the body and mind to rest inside it without instruction. You do not need to remember how this evening unfolded, and you do not need to follow it any further. The rhythm can continue on its own, just as it always has, unobserved and undisturbed. If sleep arrives, it can do so naturally, and if wakefulness lingers, it can remain quiet and light, supported by the same calm that carried the evening to its close. Good night.